Fenian Raids are often viewed as a typically, quote, Irish, unquote, harebrained scheme drawn up by a group of nutters who somehow believed that you could liberate Ireland by invading Canada. Now, on the face of it, it does indeed seem absurd, but it's a failure of historical imagination to leave it at that. The Fenian Raids have to be set against the background of the Great Irish Famine, which occurred between 1846 and 1851. 1 million people out of a population of 8 million died of starvation and disease, and another million emigrated, mainly to North America. Most of those migrants wound up in the United States, where a few years later, in the early 1860s, the American Civil War took place. 180,000 Irish men joined the Confederate or Union armies. So these people had bitter memories of the famine. Many of them blamed Britain for the starvation in Ireland. And they also had military training in the worst killing fields the world had ever seen. So they had the motivation and they had the means to seek revenge against the British Empire, and Canada offered the most tempting target. Many Irish people blamed Britain for the famine. After all, Ireland was ruled by Britain, and in the wealthiest country in the world, 1 million people died. How and why did this happen? For many Irish people, this was part of British indifference, a callous indifference to their suffering, or even worse, standing by and watching the famine decimate the Irish population so that Irish agriculture could be rationalized and land could be cleared. Now, this view was encapsulated by the statement of John Mitchell, an Irish revolutionary who supported the Fenian Brotherhood in the United States. The Almighty indeed created the potato blight, but the English created the famine, he said. Now, historians do not accept this view. This is a gross oversimplification of what happened. The British government can indeed be criticized for inadequate and inconsistent relief policies during the famine, but there was no genocidal intent. However, for people who were starving to death and who, for example, saw grain being shipped to the ports to feed English people, as far as they were concerned, or many of them were concerned, Britain was responsible for their suffering. Fenian Raids are often viewed as a typically, quote, Irish, unquote, harebrained scheme drawn up by a group of nutters who somehow believed that you could liberate Ireland by invading Canada. Now, on the face of it, it does indeed seem absurd, but it's a failure of historical imagination to leave it at that. From the perspective of the Fenian leaders, their strategy made a lot of sense. And the idea here was to precipitate an Anglo-American war out of which Irish liberation could emerge. England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. This was a mantra of Irish revolutionary nationalism. Why not create England's difficulty by exploiting the tensions that had existed during the Civil War between the government of Great Britain and the government of the United States? Why not get a force of men who would hold a portion of Canada for just long enough to precipitate an Anglo-American war? What would happen then? British troops would cross the Atlantic. Thousands of British troops would cross the Atlantic, which would mean they would not be available to put down a rising in Ireland. At the same time, revolutionaries in Ireland would be inspired by even partial victories of the Fenian Army, the Irish Republican Army, as it was called, in Canada. And thus inspired, they would launch a revolution at the very time that British troops were across the Atlantic fighting the Americans. This was one of the main arguments for the Fenian Raids. Now, these arguments can be faulted in many respects. In fact, the American government was not prepared to go to war with Great Britain. But the Fenian Brotherhood did not know this. And indeed, the American government made sure that they did not know this because the American government did not want to lose the Irish vote in the United States. So they led the Fenians along, never expecting that the Fenians would actually invade. As soon as the invasion took place, the Americans moved to stop it. In fact, the Fenian Raids stimulated a great deal of Canadian patriotism. But in one respect, their views were not at all far-fetched. Even the limited victory that they had against the Queen's Own at Ridgeway in June 1866 did indeed inspire Irish nationalists in Ireland. Even those who opposed the strategy of an invasion were ecstatic about the fact that for the first time since 1798, Irish men in arms had defeated the forces of the Crown. So in some respects, the thinking of the Fenian leadership was not quite as crazy as people have suggested. Thomas D'Arcy McGee was unquestionably the most important Irish-Canadian figure in the mid-19th century. He was a brilliant orator, a magnificent journalist. He was the most intellectually gifted of the Fathers of Confederation. He was a powerful force, a political force, a human force in 19th century Canadian politics, and indeed Irish and American politics as well. He had been a revolutionary. In 1848, he adopted a platform that in many ways anticipated that of the Fenians a decade later. So he was about as revolutionary as you could get. He proudly described himself after he got out of Ireland with the British Army and police on his trail. He proudly described himself as a traitor to the British government. 9 years later, he's in Canada as a changed man, someone who has turned against revolutionary nationalism, somebody who now believes that it is counterproductive for Ireland, that it's the worst possible course for Ireland. He thinks this because the lesson he has drawn from the failed rising of 1848 is that Ireland can never be powerful enough to defeat Britain in a straight-up fight. If revolution was impossible in Ireland, then the way ahead was reform. But revolutionaries were the enemy of reform. Reform needed to be predicated on the assumption that the Irish, if treated fairly, would become loyal subjects of the Crown. For McGee, this is what Canada exemplified. This was the great lesson that Canada held for Ireland. And this was the great lesson that could be destroyed if the Fenians got a foothold among the Irish Catholics in Canada. This was one of the main reasons why he believed that the Fenians must be crushed in Canada. Now, if you're a Fenian or a Fenian sympathizer in Canada, D'Arcy McGee is the archetypal traitor. Here is someone who was once like you, who was once a radical, who was once a revolutionary. D'Arcy McGee might even have been the person who inspired you to become a radical and a revolutionary. And now look at him, hobnobbing with John A. Macdonald, an orange man, mixing with conservative politicians, spouting off against the Fenians, attacking everything he once was, and getting paid for it as a cabinet minister as well. It's the jingling of treasury gold that's behind D'Arcy McGee's conversion to conservatism. This is the Fenian interpretation. McGee was regarded as a traitor to Ireland, and the penalty for treason was a bullet through the back of the head.